It's my great pleasure today to introduce our guest, Emily Faux, who is visiting us from the University of Newcastle in the UK. She's with us for a couple of weeks, or has been here for a couple of weeks, and is only here for a few more days, right? So use the opportunity, those of you who are here, if you want to catch up with Emily, she's here for a few more days. So Emily is a PhD student at the University of Newcastle. She's also teaching at University of Leeds, right? In communications. So she's doing multiple things. She's writing a thesis. She's more than halfway through towards the latter part of a thesis on using popular imaginaries to kind of rethink, understand, reconceptualize questions of nuclear weapons and war. A very innovative thesis, and we'll talk today about the innovative nature of her thesis. But I also want to stress that Emily is an exceptionally prolific and published author already, very impressive for the stage of a PhD. She's got articles out in Media, War and Conflict, in the Review of International Studies, in Feminist Theory, and in Critical Studies on Security. And whenever I open up my computer once a week, I'll see a new publications coming out by Emily. So we're pleased to have you. Welcome.
Thank you.
I look forward to the session. We'll do it in a similar way than we have done in the past. So we'll have a bit of an informal conversation I'm having with Emily for the first 20-30 minutes about her work, particularly about the methodological dimensions of her work. And then we'll open it up to those of you here and those online. And as we've done in the past, we'll head down for drinks and pizza. Everyone is welcome to join us here, so please come along if you have time. I wish I could extend that to the people online, but we're not quite there yet in terms of virtual interactions. Now let's start off, Emily. I wanted to ask you maybe a little bit about why did you get interested in questions of nuclear weapons and war for your PhD? What sort of got you interested in that topic?
Yeah, so I actually became interested in nuclear weapons politics through taking a module of that name. Laura Considine was a module leader on my undergraduate degree. And I took a module literally called Nuclear Weapons Politics, and I don't know to this day why. I had no knowledge or interest in nuclear weapons, really never ever thought about them despite doing an international relations degree. But the module blew my mind every single class. I was really struck by both the kind of shock of how little I knew and how little all my friends and family knew, like living in a nuclear weapons state and just having no idea what our own government is kind of investing in, and just knew nothing about the consequences of nuclear war. And I also carried with me the whole way through my undergraduate, my master's, and still a kind of interest in language, metaphors, post-structuralist theory, discourse. Always was really interested in the kind of constructed nature of world politics. So then on this module, I was introduced to the idea of the textuality of the bomb. It's Jacques Derrida who described nuclear weapons as fabulously textual through and through, which is a very strange idea, these kind of material, metallic weapons being described as textual. But it's this idea that actually when total nuclear war has never been seen, this kind of idea of the apocalyptic use of nuclear weapons. So he describes it as this elusive signifier. It's something that there is no real referent for, kind of past or present. So it's kind of only imagined. It only exists in kind of speculation, imagination, film, wargaming. And then this idea that even if it did happen, because it's not a fiction in the sense that it can't happen, it's a material reality, but it would then become this non-referent of an event, this kind of remainderless event. There's no position from which you can narrate that event if there is this kind of total apocalypse. And it's kind of this idea of this end of the archive. And not everyone agrees with this kind of theory of the textuality of the bomb, but that got me really, really interested in nuclear politics, was this idea. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what bridged the two things about this module that gripped me, this like kind of shock that I know nothing, and this idea of like narrative and existing in the imagination. And it's what led me to my thesis, which is really interested in fiction and fictional narratives about nuclear weapons, because for me, fiction was both that bridge between, well, how do we get people to care and to listen and to actually know about nuclear weapons? And for me, that was, well, we make it entertaining, and we engage with popular culture, and we make it more of a kind of current issue. And how do we engage with this fact that maybe it's unnarratable or beyond representation or something we cannot see? And then fiction to me was also the answer there, that we can explore worlds that aren't possible through fiction.
Yeah. You've already touched on a whole range of kind of issues that I did I perhaps have to say I did read Emily's draft chapter, one of the draft chapters of her thesis. So there's a lot of sort of issues that I was keen to discuss with you, and quite a few of them you brought up already. The difficulty of sort of representing nuclear weapons, the fact that, we, as opposed to many other things, it's not something we do see in everyday life, or we even, we can look at historical events, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in general, the nuclear weapons are something that sort of hover over us, but are really hard to imagine, especially their kind of destructive power. So that sort of difficulty of really grasping what they are, is that what led you kind of to explore, as you said, more alternative methods? Is that did you find that like conventional ways of understanding, conventional social scientific methods aren't really adequate to understand the issue? Is that what led you to use methods that are sort of more unusual?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, in my thesis, I use creative methodology. It's kind of researcher-led creative methodology. So it's rather than my participants engaging with some creative methods, it's all kind of me, which is kind of scary, but also I think interesting. And I use collage as method, which is mainly the chapter we'll be thinking about today. But I also do fiction writing and write short stories, and my thesis includes fictional writing as well as reflective writing and some poetry as well. And I think, yes, I came to use creative writing creative methods out of a kind of frustration with the methods that were available to me. None of them felt quite right for studying the kind of very interdisciplinary and abstract ideas that I was interested in, which was this idea of fictionality and narrative and kind of stories, images, imagination, things like that. And I think it didn't make intuitive sense to have a case study approach. And how do you choose one instance of the nuclear imagination, or how do you kind of confine an image to a time period when it's so kind of intertextual and historical? And methods kept leading me down these roads where I felt like I was forcing a research question that could be answered by methods, rather than choosing a method that my questions helped with. And then one of my supervisors actually introduced me to this idea of a post-qualitative inquiry, which is the idea that rather than using kind of traditional qualitative research methods, you begin by reading philosophy and just kind of being really situated within your material. And at this point, my material was very much nuclear popular culture. So I was literally like playing video games, reading comics, reading novels, watching films. I was very like within this space of nuclear pop culture. But it was like a weird space, because I wasn't watching these films like the normal audience. I was thinking very critically about them because of the philosophy, the post-structuralist theory I was reading. And post-qualitative inquiry describes this space as the speculative middle. And I quite like that label, this idea that you're kind of in the middle and able to start speculating and asking questions. And I kind of noticed there was something different between the way that nuclear war was represented, mainly in films about nuclear weapons and war, and how conventional war was represented. I didn't really know what that was. I could like see that there was something I couldn't quite see. And that's what actually like led me to collaging, because I decided, well, I'm just going to look at the moment of kind of harm in conventional war and in nuclear war. And for conventional war films, it tended to be this kind of long shot of the body across the screen with multiple comrades and soldiers all surrounding this kind of typical fallen soldier image. And then for nuclear war, there wasn't many examples. We tend to see nuclear war either not represented as a kind of post-apocalyptic event or narrowly averted by a kind of hero. But when it is represented, it's often like this mushroom cloud from afar. So there really wasn't many examples, but I did find examples of harm by nuclear war. And what I found was that it was the close-up, rather than this kind of image of the body with multiple people in it. It was one individual, and it was an image of their face, kind of their face melting, their face turned to a skeleton, their face kind of x-rayed. And collage allowed me to really like see this by kind of freezing these moments, putting them all together, cutting them out. And suddenly I was left with on the table these like huge faces and tiny bodies, even though I'd taken them all from an A5 page, A4 page for all of them.
Can you explain to us a little bit, maybe more backtrack, that you used a whole range of different methods, poetry, video games. So how does collage work? Like how in a very, very simple, concrete way, do you, how do you go about? You pick films first, and then you do stills of the films, and then you cut them out, or how do you go about?
So how did mine collage work?
In a very concrete sense, what did you do?
So in very for what I did, I wouldn't say this is how collage works, because it won't be the case for everyone. But I kind of, my material, I suppose, my source images were these kind of individual scenes from films. And it actually became even narrower than that. It became the bodies in these films, these kind of frozen fragments. So it's definitely not something that would be seen as kind of data in a traditional sense.
How do you pick the films in the first instance? Did you just feel you needed a number of films representing nuclear war, a number of films representing conventional war? What was the logic?
So it was largely from this kind of being immersed in the culture, Reddit referrals, people telling me more and more examples that I didn't know online, friends and family telling me more and more, kind of going down rabbit holes of just finding there's really, from what I found, not many examples in terms of nuclear war of actual like representation of harm. Conventional war, there was far more, but it wasn't about kind of numbers at all. Like there wasn't a kind of amount I needed. I was just trying, at this point, I didn't even know this would be in my thesis. I didn't know it would be a method. I was just trying to see what I thought there was a difference. I thought there was something going on between nuclear war films and conventional war, and I wanted to just see what that was and think about it a bit more and think about this significant difference. And in many ways, the first step that I took was akin to a content analysis. I started to kind of categorize these images on my table and put them into kind of the different categories of, like, there was hazmat suits, and there was the close-ups, there was mid shots, and I was like moving things around in that way. And I have some examples on the table of what ended up being they kind of ended up on my table looking like a mushroom cloud. So then I played with that idea with putting these faces into a mushroom cloud. You could feel free to have a look at that if you want to in the room. But I think for me, there isn't like a way to collage, and something that I'm kind of grappling with is that I don't think my collage per se is necessarily the output of my work. The process of collaging helped me to think through these ideas, this idea of the face. I've kind of developed this theory of a nuclear face politics and thinking about the differences in
harm. What do you mean with that? So you refer to, or you use Jenny Atkins' work on that. Yeah. So why is the face important for your work on nuclear weapons? What role does it play?
So I found that the face is this really significant site of nuclear war where it isn't for conventional war, where for conventional war we see kind of missing limbs and bodily harm and the return of the kind of wounded soldier, kind of wheelchair tropes and things like that. Whereas with nuclear war, this kind of idea that the face was a really significant site, and it led me to think about, well, what does it mean to individualize something that is so inherently collective, where like a bullet can wound the individual body, like a nuclear weapon is inevitably national, regional, global impacts. So that was a question I was working through. And also using Jenny Atkins' theory of face politics, like why the face, what does the face mean? And Atkins theorizes that the face is very much a site of this facade of the individual subject, that this kind of maintaining this notion of individuality and like Western notions of the individual, and to kind of see that melting is monstrous and we're very adverse to it, which you might think is kind of intuitively anti-nuclear war or quite critical of nuclear war to see this image, but what I kind of develop in the chat, how it's very much a site of the nuclear sublime or the nuclear uncanny, and what the kind of image of the melting face does, and it's kind of really, really central, is ultimately center how we imagine nuclear weapons by their use, by this kind of apocalyptic image. And it makes that very, very visible, which has both like positives and negatives. But what it makes very invisible is the kind of ongoing harms of the nuclear industrial complex. And it kind of makes nuclear weapons be imagined as this kind of future possibility rather than a very kind of everyday infrastructure, global infrastructure, which is what I kind of problematize.
So you found these differences between popular representations, film representations of nuclear war and conventional war quite consistent in the way you looked at?
Yeah, there's definitely like exceptions that prove the rule, and there's never going to be like a sole interpretation. But yeah, there was definitely this close-up of the face reoccurring, and really throughout time, like a really striking example is the Christopher Nolan's film Oppenheimer. It was heavily criticized for not showing harm by nuclear war and not showing any Japanese victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but there is one image of nuclear harm in the film, and it's actually a casting of Christopher Nolan's own daughter, and in this kind of hallucination, Oppenheimer imagines her face melting off in this bright light, and that's the only representation of harm we see, and it is his own daughter in this very kind of Hiroshima, USA, what if this happened to us, kind of imaginary of harm. But we see it all the way back to kind of 80s critical nuclear war films. Threads, the main kind of iconic image from the film Threads is the traffic warden covered in bandages, that became the kind of poster of that event. And even in kind of science fiction, Wolverine, it's his face that it zooms in on and melts. And I've definitely noticed it as a very reoccurring trope.
What's the kind of explicit political implications of that, you think, seeing nuclear war represented like that? Does it make it, do you think that gives us an accurate sense of what's the horror of nuclear war? Does it fall short, or how do you kind of know that you might not have thought through that yet, but sort of what does it tell us about the politics of nuclear weapons, so to speak, given the fact that films are very influential, we often see them, our perceptions of nuclear weapons is shaped by them, you know, that's kind of it, they play actually a huge role in how the collective imagines.
So I don't think it does any particular one thing, because some films are very intense, like intent on being anti-nuclear, and others are there just for entertainment, not trying to be accurate, things like that. But I do definitely think that it's significant, and there's a few reasons really. The nuclear face that we see melting so often is a civilian face, which I think is significant for imagining nuclear war as a civilian kind of activity. It's not the military face that we see defaced, which is interesting if you have read Edkin's Face Politics, and there's some work out there about the wounded veteran's body and what it does to see the kind of military body wounded to militarization. And there's a similar but different dynamic going on to see the civilian face wounded in war. But also what is quite significant is that this character tends to not be a central character and tends to have no narrative role. They're literally just an image, a sight of this kind of spectacle of nuclear war. And that's for very practical reasons. You cannot narrate past that point. There's no surviving that point of being within kind of the ground zero of a blast. So it's kind of, it negates narrativization, it negates characterization, it requires multiple characters who go on living to be more significant in order to kind of continue. So in some instances, I think it's a quite powerful side of this kind of idea of the uncanny, making the familiar strange. Like, these are civilians, this could be us, this could be my family, this could be my city. Like Threads is in Sheffield, The Day After in town in Texas. This kind of narrative definitely plays out. But on the flip side of that, these aren't characters we're supposed to really care about, engage with, dwell on. But more often than not, I think it's a site of the nuclear sublime. So it's more a site of fascination and awe, the spectacle of war. And there's a kind of double-edged sword effect, I think, of the sublime and the uncanny, where both are instances of nuclear fear, and fear can be productive towards a world without nuclear weapons and towards disarmament, but it can just as easily be mobilized in a narrative for deterrence. So this idea that nuclear weapons are awful and could destroy the world, that narrative could say, so we should get rid of them and completely disarm, or it should say, so we must maintain the credible threat of deterrent and make sure that they're never used. And this is a kind of huge problem where the same narrative has these kind of utopia, dystopia imaginaries come out of it.
Before we open up, I have one more kind of question I was curious to ask about to come back to your method again, because that's the chapter I read from your thesis on how you use collage, which is very interesting. And there's a lot of sort of international relations and people in other fields using collage as a method in the way you juxtapose war films with nuclear war films. Now, what does collage sort of add to our understanding of interpreting these films that other methods cannot kind of give us? For instance, and then we might not have an answer to that, and there are just different ways of knowing. But for instance, you mentioned content analysis. One could presumably, systematically analyze nuclear war films versus conventional war films, do a content analysis, look at categories, see how often the face appears, see how often you have representations of the sublime. What do we gain from collage? Is it that kind of an encounter? You speak of an encounter in your chapter quite often. Is it that encounter that we don't get with other methods? Or where do you think is the benefit of using collage for that kind of comparison between different genres of film, for instance, in this case?
Yeah. So for me, this kind of theory of nuclear-based politics that I developed through the paper, I don't think I would have ever landed on if I had done a critical discourse analysis or if I had done a content analysis, because I didn't know I was looking for the face. I didn't know that was going to be significant prior to the beginning. But absolutely now it is something that you could content analysis and see, do a kind of, is this recurring frequently? And that would be really interesting, but of course that would give us a frequency rather than a kind of significance of the moment in these kind of fleeting and scrappy moments of culture and nuclear culture. But I do also think it's unique from those kind of traditional quantitative and qualitative methods in that it's not only a kind of intellectual way of doing analysis, but it's also visual and it's tactile and it's aesthetic. And I think it kind of pays due to the source material, which is also visual and aesthetic and artistic. And there's this idea of using creative intelligence, kind of you're never pure. I never see myself as an artist, never kind of purely creating art, but also never only thinking kind of critically. There's this kind of space in the middle, thinking creatively and critically at the same time, which I think allows you to create something new, rather than just kind of interpret and analyze. You can also produce something. And even though I kind of prioritize in my work the process of creative work, we still get an output of that, which in this case is a collage. In some of my work is a story. In other works, it's poems. And these outputs, they kind of show as well as tell, and they can help to deconstruct the kind of hierarchy of a reader and a writer. You know, someone will read fiction in a very different way to they'll read academic text, and maybe let their guards down, maybe be more open to imagining different realities or different worlds and asking different questions. And that's kind of what I aim to do. It's kind of in my collage, by you're showing someone all these kind of moments from different films that they never would have put together. They're from different genres, they're from different time periods, from different countries. And it's I think I sometimes I play with the word confusion and say I'm moving from a space of kind of confusion to con-fusion, and I'm like bringing together these things that are strange and showing how actually they're similar, or how they're different. You can play with juxtaposition in a collage and take things that would always have been separate and never kind of brought into conversation, and really show how they can be connected. That kind of maxim of making the familiar strange and the strange familiar, taking something from the everyday and something that's very kind of normal, like sitting and watching a film, and really turning that into a moment of politics by kind of through the visual, I think.
So look, I think we'll give other people the chance to come in and maybe give you some feedback. As I said, Emily is really keen on this is a work in progress chapter. She is keen on getting feedback on how, both about the chapter, I think, but also on how that fits into your overall thesis, of how to kind of analyze representations of nuclear war that are kind of, I think is a really, really important issue in a sense that this is something unimaginable really for us, the consequences, and yet we do have to imagine it. You know, we do have to make it part of political discussions. And I think that's a good instance where representations of popular culture are actually very important. They allow us to imagine that which, you know, is beyond the imagination. So